The primary reason why the early church was not the Roman Catholic Church is because the early church did not view the Bishop of Rome as the vicar of Christ on earth. They did not view him as possessing universal jurisdiction over the entire church on earth, and they certainly did not believe him to possess an ability to speak infallibly on faith and morals. In other words, the early church did not believe in the concept of the papacy, the office of the Pope, that we see in the modern Roman Catholic Church today. The concept of the papacy really is the entire issue on which the Roman Catholic Church either stands or falls. Had the early church genuinely believed in the office of the papacy in the way that the modern Roman Church does, then that would mean the Roman Church is indeed the true church, and all people are under an obligation to submit to its authority. On the contrary, however, which is the case, if the early church did not view the Bishop of Rome in this manner, then that means the Roman Church today, regardless of how many other doctrines they may get correct, is certainly not the true church. They are not the apostolic church, and everyone has an obligation to ensure they do not submit themselves to her authority. One of the clearest reasons why the early church did not believe the Bishop of Rome to be the vicar of Christ is because the Church of Rome itself, in the first century, did not feature a singular monarchical bishop. This is demonstrated by a letter written by the Church of Rome, which has traditionally been ascribed under the name of Clement of Rome, one of the leaders of that church. Speaking to the structure of the church's government, Clement states that the apostles appointed as their successors only 2, not 3, offices of church government: bishops and deacons. And furthermore, Clement actually insists that the establishment of these 2 offices is fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy from the book of Isaiah. Roman Catholicism insists that the Christian church has always embraced 3 offices of church government, distinguishing between bishops and presbyters, and even regards this same Clement as the 4th pope of the Roman Catholic Church. But Clement's own letter demonstrates otherwise, that the church in Rome, rather than observing 3 offices of church government, only observed 2. In fact, because Clement believes the 2-office structure is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, that means that if there was indeed 3 offices established by the Lord Jesus and the apostles, then this prophecy from Isaiah would have failed, since it did not take into account that 3rd office. Just 2 chapters later, Clement does speak explicitly of presbyters, but he describes these presbyters as those who occupy the bishop's office, showing that there is no distinction of office between bishops and presbyters. Roman Catholicism's claim to be the exact faith of the early church is greatly weakened by the fact that the man they believe to be the 4th pope of their entire church himself did not realize that he was the pope during the time that he was living. The modern concept of the papacy is not only rejected by church fathers like Clement of Rome, but it is also rejected by the ecumenical councils, of which the Roman Church believes to contain infallible proclamations of dogmas of the faith. An example of this can be seen in the 6th canon of the Council of Nicaea, convened in 325 AD, which says that the Bishop of Alexandria ought to have jurisdiction over the various churches in his region, and says that this practice is also customary for the Bishop of Rome regarding the various churches in his region. In other words, the Bishop of Rome does not possess a universal jurisdiction over the entire church on earth. The Bishop of Rome certainly possesses jurisdiction over the churches in his area, but the Bishop of Alexandria possesses jurisdiction over the churches in his area, as is the case with the Bishop of Antioch and the various churches in his region, as well as all the other bishops in all the other major provinces of the Christian world. And this specific articulation of jurisdiction was not invented by the Council of Nicaea. In fact, the very first words of this canon here says that these customs are ancient. This order of jurisdiction is confirmed again not even 60 years later in the 2nd Ecumenical Council, the Council of Constantinople, which decrees that the Bishop of Alexandria alone should administer the affairs of Egypt. And that not only Alexandria, not only Rome, but the synod of every province will administer the affairs of that particular province as was decreed at the Council of Nicaea. Which means the Bishop of Rome, again, did not possess a universal jurisdiction over the church on earth. The great Western Father Jerome, often regarded as the greatest scholar in the early church, is also no friend to Roman Catholicism. In commenting on a dispute between a practice occurring in the Roman Church as compared to other churches across the world, Jerome insists that the world outweighs its capital, and that wherever there is a bishop, regardless of whatever city he may be in, Rome or elsewhere, his dignity is one and his priesthood is one. Going further, Jerome questions the one he is writing to, why do you bring forward a custom which exists in one city only, that being the city of Rome? Why do you oppose to the laws of the church a paltry exception which has given rise to arrogance and pride? Had the church in Rome possessed a universal jurisdiction over the early church, these disputes against the customs of the Roman church would be quite absurd. But not only this, Jerome could not have possibly believed the singular monarchical bishop of Rome was the vicar of Christ on earth as established by the Lord Jesus and the apostles, because, as he famously says in his commentary on Titus chapter 1 verse 5, presbyters and bishops were originally one and the same, and that gradually over time the office of bishop came to be elevated over presbyters. Because of this, he insists that bishops should know that they have their office according to the custom of the church and not according to divine right. It would be hard for Jerome to believe that the Lord Jesus established the Bishop of Rome to be the vicar of Christ on earth if Jerome didn't even believe that such an office existed in the first place. And as a final witness for this video, I will once again appeal to a bishop of Rome, but this time Gregory the Great, who, writing in the 6th century now, declares that whoever calls himself or desires to be called universal priest is in his elation the precursor of Antichrist, because he proudly puts himself above all others. Roman Catholics will often respond by insisting that Gregory was only condemning this title for other people attempting to claim it for themselves, because this title only properly applied to Gregory as the Bishop of Rome. But Gregory, as if he himself was anticipating these objections, makes clear that this warning is not only applied to his opponents, but it is applied to everybody, including himself, because he insists that whosoever this one is who covets being called sole priest extols himself above all other priests. It is certainly the precursor of Antichrist for the Bishop of Constantinople to assert that he is the universal priest, but it is also the precursor of Antichrist if the Bishop of Rome claimed the same title for himself. This view was apparently not unique to just Gregory in the 6th century. As he says elsewhere, not only him, but none of his predecessors ever consented to the name of universality. So it is clear that the early church did not believe in this modern concept of the Roman papacy. But more than this, the testimony of the early church also refutes many of the common claims made today by Roman Catholics who insist that their church is the one true church. Perhaps the most common of these claims is that the Lord Jesus conferred upon the Apostle Peter alone the keys to the kingdom of heaven, giving him an authority that exceeds all others in the church. And because his successors, the bishops of Rome, also possess these keys, they too possess a supreme authority over the church. But as I alluded to, this claim is thoroughly refuted by the testimony of the early church. For example, Cyprian of Carthage, a church father writing in the 3rd century, is a figure that is appealed to often by Roman Catholics in an attempt to prove the papacy, because Cyprian acknowledges that the Lord Jesus conferred upon Peter the keys of the kingdom. However, within the same context of this passage from Cyprian, he makes clear that he did not believe Peter to possess a superior authority above the rest of the apostles of the church. He states that after his resurrection, Christ gave an equal power to all the apostles, and that the rest of the apostles were also the same as Peter in both honor and power. Cyprian suggests that this power was given to Peter first in order that Christ might set forth unity, but that through this unity, the rest of the apostles shared in the same honor and power as Peter. The great Augustine of Hippo also supports the Protestant view on this issue, stating that the entire church, and not just Peter, received the keys of the kingdom. Peter receiving the keys first did not mean he was supreme over the church. Rather, as Augustine says, Peter receiving the keys represented the Holy Church. In fact, Roman Catholicism's unique interpretation of Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, insisting that it was here where Peter received supremacy over the church, is also utterly foreign to the early church. Vatican I may insist that these words have always been understood by the Catholic Church to be referring to a conferral of universal jurisdiction upon Peter, But the testimony of many figures from the early church says otherwise. In fact, a majority of the church fathers did not even interpret the rock upon which the church was built to be referring to Peter at all. Some Roman Catholics have gone so far as to suggest that these church fathers held to multiple different interpretations of this passage. And just because they didn't outline the view that is outlined in Vatican I, that doesn't necessarily mean they didn't believe that view. But such an assertion is simply an argument from silence that only works if one presupposes that the early church was the Roman Catholic Church, the very thing that we are disputing here in this video. Still, Roman Catholics may attempt to defend the papacy by appealing to other church fathers, for example, Ignatius of Antioch, who in his letter to the Romans describes the church in Rome as being preeminent. But this by no means proves papal supremacy, because Ignatius clarifies that the Church of Rome is preeminent in the place of the district of the Romans, which everybody agrees with. It's one thing to be preeminent in the district of the Romans, it's another thing to be preeminent throughout the entire world. Ignatius testifies to the first, he does not testify to the second. Another popular appeal made by Roman Catholics is to Irenaeus of Lyon, who in his classic work Against Heresies insists that it is necessary for every church to agree with the church in Rome on account of its preeminent authority. But like we did in the case of Ignatius, we have to ask ourselves, to what extent does this preeminent authority refer? Based on the context of the argument he is putting forth, Irenaeus locates Rome's preeminent authority in the fact that its apostolical tradition has been preserved by those who exist everywhere throughout the world and come to the city of Rome. This preeminent authority is not located in the office of the Bishop of Rome. As the capital of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome gathered visitors from all across the Mediterranean world. Therefore, in the church of this city, you would be able to find the true faith preserved and strengthened by the united testimony from the church throughout the world and not just one particular region. Irenaeus here is arguing against the various Gnostic groups who claim that their revelations are the true tradition from the apostles. Irenaeus refutes this by appealing to the universal witness of the Christian church. The fact that no church body throughout the entire world believed what the Gnostics believed is great evidence that the Gnostic doctrines were not from the apostles. And as an example of this universal faith, Irenaeus points to the church in Rome, the largest and greatest city of the empire, because it contains a high concentration of not only Christians in the city of Rome, but Christians throughout the world visiting the city of Rome, all of which testify to the same apostolic faith that is held by their churches back at their homes. This is confirmed by earlier words from Irenaeus, who says that he will use the Church of Rome as one example of this principle because it would be very tedious to reckon up the successions of every church throughout the world. Irenaeus comments that this church was founded not just by Peter, but by Peter and Paul. And as a last point, Irenaeus points to the Church of Rome because he is writing from modern-day France. This means that Irenaeus would obviously have great personal familiarity with this church more than other apostolical churches such as Antioch and Jerusalem. Irenaeus may describe the Church of Rome as possessing preeminent authority, but he nowhere mentions the Bishop of Rome as the foundational source behind this preeminent authority. If the early church was indeed the Roman Catholic Church, then Irenaeus' appeal to universality would be absurd. All he would have to do to refute the Gnostics is simply to appeal to the decree of the Pope, simply saying that Gnosticism is wrong because the Bishop of Rome decreed that Gnosticism is wrong. This is something he obviously does not do. And as a final comment before moving on to reason number 2, Roman Catholics are correct that many church fathers recognized a primacy of the church in Rome. But this does not prove Roman Catholicism, because primacy does not equal supremacy. Primacy merely refers to the high honor that the church in Rome is regarded in, because it was the church founded by Peter and Paul, because of the great city that it was located on, and other various reasons. Supremacy, on the other hand, suggests that the Bishop of Rome not only possesses great honor in the eyes of the other churches, but that it actually possesses a universal jurisdiction and authority over all other churches on earth. Protestants, alongside the early church, happily acknowledge that the Bishop of Rome possessed a position of primacy, but we, along with the early church as well, reject the idea that the Bishop of Rome possessed a position of supremacy. Because the early church rejected the concept of papal supremacy, this means that the early church was not the Roman Catholic Church. And if you wish to be consistent with the earliest Christians, then you too should reject the Roman Catholic Church.